Millionaire CEO went to buy an engagement cake and saw his ex behind the counter holding a little girl. The glass door gave a soft chime as Vernon Ebert stepped inside Sweet Haven Bakery. He paused just past the entrance, one hand still resting on the brass handle as warm air settled around him. The place smelled of fresh vanilla and butter. Simple, comforting, the kind of scent that belonged to birthdays, quiet mornings, and small celebrations he rarely made time for anymore. Outside, his driver waited beside a black car worth more than most homes on the street. Inside, everything felt slower, softer, real in a way his usual world never was. Vernon adjusted his cuff out of habit, scanning the display case filled with neatly decorated cakes. He had come for one reason only: order the engagement cake, confirm the pickup date, and get back to a schedule that did not allow delays. It was supposed to be a 5-minute stop. Nothing important, just another task between meetings. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't move further in right away. He stood there, successful, composed, completely in control, and strangely reluctant to take the next step. Before he could step toward the counter, a soft laugh carried across the room. It wasn't loud, yet it cut through the quiet clink of plates and low conversation like it had been waiting for him. Vernon stilled. The sound was warm, easy, unmistakably genuine, nothing like the polished voices he heard all day in boardrooms. For a second he forgot about the cake, the schedule, the reason he had walked in at all, because that laugh felt known, uncomfortably known, like hearing a song you haven't played in years and somehow still remember every note. Vernon didn't take another step. His hand remained on the brass handle as if letting go might confirm something he wasn't ready to face. The quiet confidence he carried into every meeting seemed to vanish, replaced by a stillness he couldn't explain. People moved around him, someone ordering coffee, another picking up a box tied with ribbon, but their voices faded into the background. All his focus narrowed to that single sound echoing in his mind. For a man used to making fast decisions worth millions, the hesitation felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. He stood there longer than he should have, caught between turning back outside or finding out why that laugh had stopped him cold. 7 years. The number surfaced in Vernon's mind with quiet certainty. 7 years since he had last heard that exact laugh, unforced, bright, the kind that used to show up at the end of long study nights and cheap coffee dates. 7 years filled with airport lounges, late-night negotiations, and a calendar that never seemed to clear. He had told himself that chapter of his life was closed, packed away somewhere behind quarterly reports and headlines with his name printed in bold. Yet the memory didn't feel distant now. It felt immediate, close enough to touch, and that realization unsettled him more than any risky deal ever had. A quiet pressure settled in his chest. It didn't make sense. He had walked into the bakery focused, efficient, already thinking about the next call on his schedule. Moments like this, unplanned, emotional, distracting, didn't usually reach him. Yet now his attention refused to return to the display of cakes in front of him. Instead, his mind raced through possibilities he wasn't ready to name. New city, new routines, new life. There was no logical reason that sound should belong to anyone from his past, and still, a single thought kept pushing forward, steady and impossible to ignore. What if it is her? For the first time in years, Vernon felt something he couldn't control with a decision or a signature. Uncertainty. And it held him right where he stood. Have you ever walked into an ordinary place, just another stop in your day, and suddenly come face to face with someone you never expected to see again? Not someone recent. Someone from a version of your life you thought was long behind you. The kind of person connected to memories you don't revisit often because everything has changed since then. Your priorities, your routines, even the way people see you now. Those moments don't give you time to prepare. They arrive without warning, asking a question you didn't plan to answer. And in that brief pause, you realize the past isn't as distant as you convinced yourself it was. For some people, progress comes with applause, titles, recognition, numbers that prove you made it. But growth often asks for something in return. Long hours replace conversations. Opportunities demand distance. Slowly, without any dramatic moment, certain names stop appearing on your phone. From the outside, everything looks impressive. Inside, there are gaps where familiar voices used to be. Vernon had built a life many would envy: precision, influence, access to rooms most never enter. Yet standing there in that small bakery, one unexpected sound carried more weight than all the achievements that filled his resume. Because success can elevate your status, while quietly reducing the number of people who truly know who you used to be. There are seasons when everything appears exactly the way it's supposed to. The career is solid. The schedule is full. The future is mapped out with neat, confident plans. From the outside, it's the kind of life people congratulate without hesitation. Yet in the quieter hours, late evenings, silent rooms, long drives with no calls coming in, there's a strange stillness that success alone doesn't fill. Not sadness, not failure, just the sense that something meaningful is missing, even when nothing seems technically wrong. Vernon knew that feeling well. His world was polished, efficient, and carefully structured, yet it often felt like a place designed for productivity, not warmth. And standing there in a bakery meant for celebrations, that contrast became impossible to ignore. The reason Vernon had walked into Sweet Haven Bakery was simple. In less than 2 weeks, he was supposed to be getting married. The date was set. The venue was booked months in advance. Invitations had already reached people whose calendars filled just as quickly as his own. On paper, everything was aligned. The woman he was engaged to matched his world. Refined, accomplished, respected in the same circles that now defined his daily life. Their partnership made sense. That was the word everyone used. It made sense professionally, socially, logistically, which was exactly why he had come to order the final detail, the engagement cake that would sit at the center of a celebration designed to look flawless from every angle. A straightforward task, one more confirmation before the next chapter officially began, and until a few seconds ago, he hadn't questioned it once. What Vernon didn't realize, standing there with his hand still near the door, was that this quick stop was about to interrupt a future he had already scheduled down to the minute. He believed he was here to confirm a cake flavor, write down 2 names, and leave. Another efficient decision, another box checked. But a few steps ahead of him, just beyond the glass display and the quiet hum of the bakery, waited a part of his life he had filed away years ago and never expected to face again. He had spent 7 years building distance between who he used to be and who the world now saw. 7 years proving that discipline and ambition could rewrite any past. Yet in the next few moments, without warning or preparation, that carefully managed distance was about to collapse. Not with drama, not with noise, just with one familiar voice, and the truth it carried with it. Before a single word was exchanged, the conflict had already taken hold. Vernon could feel it in the hesitation that replaced his usual certainty. He was a man known for clear decisions, quick conclusions, and a steady hand even under pressure. Yet here, in a quiet neighborhood bakery, none of that confidence seemed to apply. Part of him wanted to turn around, step back outside, and return to the version of the day he had planned. Predictable, efficient, untouched. Another part of him needed to know. Needed to confirm whether the voice he had just heard belonged to someone he once promised he would never leave behind. That silent pull between moving forward with the life he had carefully constructed and facing a memory he had buried under years of achievement settled in before the story had even properly begun. And once that kind of tension appears, it doesn't wait for permission. It asks to be answered. Tonight's story isn't about money, titles, or the kind of victories that make headlines. It's about the quieter price that sometimes comes attached to getting everything you once chased. Because ambition can open doors most people never reach, but it can also close others without you noticing at the time. The kind that lead back to people who knew you before your name carried weight. As Vernon stood there, caught between stepping forward and walking away, he had no idea that this brief stop would force him to measure his achievements against something far more personal. What it actually cost him to become the man everyone now admired, and whether that price had been higher than he ever intended to pay. In just a few seconds, Vernon would take a step toward the counter, a simple, ordinary movement. Yet that single step was about to connect 3 lives that had been moving forward on completely different paths for years. One man convinced his future was already decided, and one little girl who had no idea that the stranger about to look her way was tied to her story in the deepest possible way. None of them had planned this moment. None of them expected it. But once it happened, there would be no returning to the lives they had been living before that door ever opened. Before we step further into Vernon's story, welcome. If you're joining for the first time, you're in the right place for grounded, character-driven stories that focus on real choices and real consequences. And to those who return each time for a new narrative, thank you for being part of this space where we slow down and pay attention to the moments that actually shape a life. Settle in, because this is one of those stories that begins quietly and then asks a question that doesn't let go easily. If you appreciate stories that focus on meaningful choices, second chances, and the moments that quietly change everything, consider subscribing to Mr. Williams' Storytime. This channel is built for listeners who enjoy narratives that are calm, engaging, and grounded in real human experiences, not noise, not exaggeration, just stories that stay with you after they end. And if this opening already has you wondering how one ordinary stop at a neighborhood bakery could reshape a man's future, stay with me, because what Vernon is about to discover will challenge everything he thought he had already settled. Vernon finally released the door handle and stepped properly into Sweet Haven Bakery. The soft chime faded behind him as the glass door settled back into place, cutting off the distant city noise. Inside, everything felt contained. Warm light, low conversation, the gentle rhythm of a place built for unhurried moments. He moved a few steps forward, polished shoes crossing a floor dusted faintly with flour near the counter. The space wasn't large, but it was carefully kept. Display cases lined with neatly arranged cakes, handwritten tags, small details that suggested patience rather than speed. This wasn't the kind of environment Vernon usually entered without an assistant or a schedule buffer. Most of his days were spent in rooms designed for efficiency. Clean lines, minimal personality, decisions made quickly and recorded even faster. Here, nothing seemed rushed. Someone laughed near the back. A mixer hummed briefly, then stopped. A box was tied with ribbon while a customer waited with quiet excitement. For the first time that day, Vernon noticed himself slowing his pace without meaning to. He approached the display case, glancing over rows of carefully iced designs, anniversaries, birthdays, small celebrations captured in sugar and color. Each cake looked like it had been made for a specific person, not a general order. That detail lingered with him longer than expected, because in his world most things were scalable, repeatable, optimized. This place clearly wasn't. He adjusted his cuff again, a habit that usually centered him, then lifted his gaze toward the counter, preparing to speak, finalize the order and move on. Just another stop. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. Warm air settled around Vernon as he stood near the counter, carrying the steady scent of vanilla, melted butter, and fresh bread just pulled from the oven. It wasn't overwhelming, just present, comforting in a way that felt unfamiliar after years spent in climate-controlled offices that smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. The lighting here was soft, not the sharp brightness of conference rooms that stayed the same from morning to night. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, catching on glass jars filled with sugar pearls and colored sprinkles. Small details most people would overlook were given space to be noticed. Behind the counter, trays cooled on metal racks. A handwritten menu hung slightly crooked on the wall, updated with neat, patient lettering. Nothing about the place aimed to impress, it simply felt lived in. Vernon realized he could hear individual sounds, the light scrape of a spatula against a bowl, the quiet murmur of a mother speaking to her child, the faint crinkle of a pastry bag being folded closed. In his usual environment, noise blended into a constant background, phones vibrating, keyboards tapping, voices layered over one another. Here every sound had room to breathe. The contrast was subtle but undeniable. One world moved fast enough to measure success by minutes. This one seemed built around moments people actually wanted to remember. And standing there in a tailored suit that suddenly felt too formal for the room, Vernon became aware of just how far removed his daily life was from places like this. As Vernon's attention moved across the display, that same laugh reached him once more, clearer this time, coming from somewhere behind the counter. It wasn't forced or polite. It carried the easy warmth of someone reacting without thinking, the kind of sound that filled a space without demanding it. His focus shifted instantly. The cakes in front of him blurred into the background as his head turned slightly, trying to place where it had come from. Conversations around him continued, but that one sound seemed to stand apart from everything else. There was something familiar in its rhythm, an unmistakable tone he hadn't encountered in years, yet recognized before he could reason it out. His chest tightened, not from panic, but from the strange certainty that this wasn't just coincidence. People change cities, they change careers, they build entirely new lives. Voices, though, some of them stay with you longer than you expect. The laugh came again, softer now, followed by the gentle murmur of someone speaking to a child. And without meaning to, Vernon found himself listening more closely than he had listened to anything all day. Drawn by the sound, Vernon lifted his gaze toward the far side of the counter. At first, he only saw movement, someone shifting a tray aside, a figure partially turned away as she spoke to the child beside her. Then she stepped into clearer view. The world seemed to narrow. Alessia Heller stood behind the counter, a light dusting of flour along the sleeve of her blouse, her hair pulled back into a loose braid that rested over one shoulder. She was focused on the little girl at her side, adjusting the cupcake in the child's hands so the frosting wouldn't topple. For a moment, Vernon didn't breathe. 7 years had changed details. There was a calm steadiness in her posture that hadn't been there before, but there was no mistaking her. Not the way she tilted her head slightly while listening, not the quiet patience in the way she moved. Recognition hit without warning, firm and undeniable. This wasn't someone who merely resembled a memory. It was her. Standing a few steps away, in a small neighborhood bakery he had entered by chance, was the one person who had known him long before his name carried any weight. And just like that, every carefully arranged plan for the next hour slipped quietly out of focus. For a brief instant, everything seemed to hold still. The soft clatter from the kitchen faded. Conversations blurred into a distant hum. Even the steady tick of the wall clock near the register felt like it had paused between seconds. Vernon stood motionless, His attention locked on the woman behind the counter as if the rest of the room had quietly stepped aside. This wasn't how reunions were supposed to happen. No warning, no preparation, no space to collect the right words. One second he had been a customer completing a routine errand, and the next he was face to face with a part of his life he had sealed off years ago. He became aware of his own breathing, slower than usual, measured in a way that didn't match the sudden rush of thoughts pressing forward. Questions arrived all at once. How was she here? Why this city? Why now, of all days? None of them found an answer, because the only thing that felt certain in that suspended moment was this. Some encounters don't ask whether you're ready. They simply happen, and everything that follows has to adjust around them. As the initial shock settled into something steadier, Vernon noticed the details that time had quietly reshaped. Alessia looked different, not in a way that erased who she had been, but in the way life refines someone rather than hardens them. There was a softness in her expression, yet her posture carried quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't come from titles or recognition, but from learning how to handle responsibilities day after day without needing applause. Fine lines near her eyes suggested more smiles than stress. Her movements were unhurried, precise, as she wiped a small streak of frosting from the counter with practiced ease. She didn't look overwhelmed. She looked settled, like someone who had faced difficult seasons and found a steady rhythm on the other side of them. Vernon realized this wasn't the college girl who once sat across from him with oversized notebooks and hopeful plans. This was a woman who had built something real with her hands, something that required patience, consistency, and care, and for reasons he couldn't immediately explain, that quiet strength affected him more than any dramatic change could have. Only then did Vernon fully register the small figure at Alessia's side. A little girl, no older than 4, stood close to her, both hands carefully holding a cupcake topped with a swirl of chocolate frosting. She was concentrating hard, as if the responsibility of not dropping it was the most important task in the world. Alessia shifted slightly and lifted the child onto her hip with an easy, familiar motion that spoke of practice rather than effort. The girl leaned comfortably against her, completely at ease, one small arm resting around her mother's shoulder. Bright brown eyes scanned the display case with open curiosity before drifting toward Vernon without hesitation, the simple, unguarded attention only children give to strangers. A faint smudge of frosting sat on her cheek, unnoticed. Alessia brushed it away gently with her thumb, the gesture automatic and affectionate. That single movement landed heavier than Vernon expected, because it confirmed what the scene already suggested without needing explanation. This wasn't a quick visit or someone else's child she was watching for a moment. This was her daughter, and just like that, the distance between the past he remembered and the life standing in front of him widened in a way he hadn't prepared for. Alessia turned slightly, reaching for a notepad near the register, and that's when her eyes lifted. For a brief second, her expression remained neutral, the polite focus she likely gave every customer who walked through the door. Then recognition settled in. It was subtle but unmistakable, the small pause, the way her shoulders stilled, the careful inhale that followed as if she needed a moment to steady herself. Her gaze stayed on him, searching his face to confirm what instinct had already told her. 7 years had changed the details. Sharper suit, harder edges, the confidence of someone used to being listened to, but there was no mistaking who stood in front of her. Vernon saw the exact instant she knew, not surprise alone. Memory, history, questions neither of them had prepared to answer today, the space between them filled with everything unsaid, old promises, quiet endings, the weight of time that had passed without contact. Neither moved, neither spoke. Yet in that shared silence, it was clear they had both reached the same realization at the exact same moment. This meeting was not accidental in the way ordinary encounters are. It carried a past neither of them had truly left behind. Alessia was the first to break the silence. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment it seemed like she might choose a safer, more distant greeting, the kind people use when history is easier left untouched. Instead, she said his name. Vernon? The way she spoke it was quiet, almost measured, as if each letter needed to be placed with care before it reached him. Not cold, not overly warm, just careful. There was a hint of caution in her tone, the kind that comes from protecting a life you've worked hard to stabilize. Yet beneath that restraint was something familiar, recognition that hadn't faded despite the years. Hearing his name in her voice again landed harder than he expected. In boardrooms, his name carried authority. In headlines, it carried status. Here, spoken across a small bakery counter, it carried memory. For a brief second, he was no longer the man introduced by titles and achievements. He was simply Vernon, the version of himself that had existed long before success started defining him. And that shift, subtle as it was, left him searching for a response that didn't feel rehearsed. Vernon cleared his throat, buying himself a second he didn't really have. "Hi, Alessia." The words came out quieter than he intended. Simple, ordinary, nowhere near enough to carry 7 years of distance. He gave a small nod, the kind he usually used in professional settings, then immediately realized how out of place that gesture felt here. This wasn't a meeting room. There was no agenda, no prepared talking points, no safe script to follow. For someone known for speaking with confidence in front of investors and executives, the lack of structure left him oddly off balance. He shifted his weight slightly, hands settling at his sides instead of reaching for a handshake or any familiar greeting. Nothing seemed appropriate, not casual, not formal, not distant. So he stayed where he was, meeting her eyes with an expression that tried to hold steady while his thoughts struggled to catch up. In any other situation, hello would have been enough. Here, it felt like the smallest possible bridge stretched across a very long gap. The little girl shifted in Alessia's arms, her attention moving from the cupcake to the unfamiliar man standing across the counter. She studied Vernon openly, the way children do when they're trying to understand where someone fits in their world. Then, with complete sincerity, she asked, "Mommy, who's that?" Her voice was small but clear, carrying easily through the quiet space between them. The question was innocent, just curiosity, nothing more, but it landed with surprising weight, because it forced a reality neither adult had addressed yet. To the child, Vernon was simply a stranger in a suit, someone who had walked in off the street with no history attached. Vernon felt that truth settle in as he met her wide, patient gaze. There was no recognition in her eyes, no expectation, only the straightforward interest of someone meeting a new face. And for a moment he realized he had no idea what role, if any, he was supposed to play in this small, ordinary scene unfolding in front of him. Alessia adjusted her hold on the little girl, her hand resting lightly against the child's back as she answered, "This is an old friend." There was a brief pause before the last two words, as if she had considered several options and chosen the one that would keep things calm. Her tone stayed gentle, steady enough to reassure the child, yet careful in a way Vernon recognized immediately, not distant, just protective. The phrase settled between them with quiet finality. Old friend. After everything they had once shared, the plans, the late-night conversations, the promises that had felt permanent, that was what remained safe to say out loud. Vernon gave a small nod, accepting the description without correcting it. There wasn't any other label that fit the moment without opening questions neither of them were ready to answer in front of a 4-year-old holding a cupcake. Still, the words carried weight. They marked the boundary of the life Alessia had built since he left, one where his place, if it existed at all, was somewhere in the past. And hearing himself reduced to something so polite, so contained, made the distance of those 7 years feel suddenly very real. The words lingered longer than they should have. Old friend. Simple, harmless, easy for anyone listening nearby to accept without a second thought. Yet for Vernon, they carried the full distance of everything that had changed. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Once, he had been the person she called first, before decisions, before doubts, before anything important. Now he stood across a counter, introduced with a label that kept the past neatly closed. It wasn't unfair. If anything, it was generous. There were other ways she could have described him, ways that would have carried frustration or disappointment, but she had chosen the calmest version available. That choice said more than any accusation could have. Vernon understood in that quiet moment that whatever they had once been no longer belonged to the present she was protecting. And accepting that truth required a steadiness he usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations, except this time there was no strategy to rely on, just memory, and the realization that time doesn't wait for people to be ready before it moves on. Vernon straightened slightly, returning to the reason he had come in, the one detail that still gave him something practical to hold on to. "I need to order a cake," he said, his voice measured but not as firm as usual. An engagement cake. The words felt heavier once spoken out loud. In meetings, announcements like that would have been followed by congratulations, handshakes, a quick shift to logistics. Here, they settled into the quiet space between him and Alessia with none of that momentum. He watched her expression carefully. She didn't react with surprise or visible hurt. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod, the kind someone offers a customer placing any normal order. "Of course," she said gently. "What date do you need it for?" Professional, composed, focused on the task. The ease with which she moved into business mode made the situation feel even more real. This wasn't a dramatic reunion. It was a transaction, one where his future was being written down on an order pad while his past stood just a few feet away holding a child. For the first time since walking in, Vernon became aware of how strange the moment must look from the outside. A man in an expensive suit, ordering a cake to celebrate a commitment, while standing face to face with someone who had once been the center of his life. Alessia reached for the order pad and clicked her pen, her movements calm and practiced. "That's nice," she said softly. "Congratulations." Her tone carried no edge, just simple courtesy, the same warmth she would offer any customer sharing good news. If there was anything else beneath it, she kept it carefully out of view. Vernon inclined his head in acknowledgement, unsure whether to say thank you or explain something that didn't yet have clear words. The moment didn't leave space for either. The little girl shifted in her arms, still focused on her cupcake, unaware of the weight hanging between the two adults. Alessia glanced down at the page, ready to write. Names for the top? Such a routine question, asked countless times for countless celebrations. Yet here, it landed like a quiet test, because answering it would make his future official in a way that thinking about it never had. And for the first time since he had agreed to the engagement, Vernon felt the full weight of saying those names out loud, while standing across from the woman who had once known him before any of it existed. Before Vernon could answer Alessia's question, the little girl leaned forward slightly in her arms, curiosity bright in her eyes. "What flavor are you getting?" Her voice carried the earnest seriousness only children manage when discussing something they consider extremely important. The question caught Vernon off guard. In boardrooms, people asked about projections, timelines, risk. Here, the decision in front of him had been reduced to something simple, flavor. He blinked once, almost smiling at the unexpected shift. He paused, realizing he hadn't actually thought that far. The cake had been another item on a checklist, delegated in his mind before he even walked in. The girl waited patiently, as if this answer mattered more than anything else in the room. For a moment, the tension between past and present eased, replaced by something disarmingly ordinary. A child holding a cupcake, asking a straightforward question. And Vernon, a man used to having immediate answers, found himself considering it seriously for the first time. Vernon let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh. "Seems like I should have prepared for that question," he admitted. The little girl studied him with exaggerated patience, as if she were giving him a fair chance to recover from a very serious mistake. "You can't pick a cake without knowing the flavor," she said matter-of-factly, holding her cupcake a little higher like evidence. Alessia's lips curved slightly despite herself, the hint of a smile she didn't try to hide. For the first time since he walked in, the tightness in Vernon's shoulders eased. It was such a small exchange, no history, no complicated meaning, just a child insisting that cake decisions required proper thought. And somehow, that simple moment cut through the tension better than any careful words could have. Vernon glanced at the cupcake in the little girl's hands, then back at the rows of cakes behind the glass. "Chocolate," he said after a brief pause. "I think I'll go with chocolate." The choice felt oddly deliberate, even though it was the simplest option available. Rich, familiar, safe, no risk of disappointing anyone. The girl nodded with clear approval, as if he had finally given the correct answer after careful consideration. "Good," she said, satisfied. "Chocolate is the best." A faint smile touched Vernon's face before he could stop it. In his world, decisions usually came with charts, projections, and long discussions. Here, the verdict had been delivered by someone small enough to need help reaching the counter. And somehow, her certainty made the moment feel lighter than anything he'd experienced all day. Across from him, Alessia wrote the flavor down with steady, practiced handwriting, calm, focused, as if this were just another ordinary order. But to Vernon, even that simple word, chocolate, felt like it had marked the start of something he hadn't planned for. The little girl gave a firm nod, clearly pleased with his decision. "Good choice," she said, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who took desserts very seriously. She adjusted her grip on the cupcake, careful not to smudge the frosting, and looked at him with open approval, as if he had just passed a small but important test. Vernon chuckled under his breath, the sound softer than the laughter he used in public settings. It surprised him how quickly her confidence had shifted the mood. Moments earlier, the space between him and Alessia had been filled with years of distance. Now, a 4-year-old's simple endorsement had introduced an ease he hadn't expected. There was no pressure in her reaction, no history attached, just a child satisfied that the celebration would have the right cake. And in that uncomplicated approval, Vernon felt something unfamiliar in his chest, a brief, quiet sense of being welcomed into the moment instead of standing outside of it. Alessia shifted the little girl slightly on her hip, then steadied the order pad against the counter. With calm, practiced movements, she wrote down the flavor beneath the date, her pen gliding across the page with the same neat precision Vernon remembered from years ago. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain, just careful, consistent handwriting that suggested she had filled out hundreds of these forms before his. A small strand of hair slipped loose near her temple as she leaned forward. She brushed it back absent-mindedly, still focused on getting the details right. The normalcy of the action stood in quiet contrast to everything Vernon was processing. To her, this was part of the day's work, another customer, another celebration being prepared. To him, the moment felt strangely significant, as if each word she wrote was fixing something into place that he hadn't fully examined until now. Ink on paper, simple, final. He watched her finish the line, realizing that while his life usually moved through digital approvals and quick signatures, this, pen, paper, steady hands, felt more personal than most agreements he'd made in years. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, seeing her write his order down made the situation feel far more real than when he had first spoken it. As Alessia finished noting the details, Vernon's attention settled on the page for a fraction longer than necessary. Her handwriting was the same, neat, even, patient. Each letter formed with care, as if rushing had never been part of her nature. A quiet memory surfaced, old notebooks spread across a cafe table, her pen moving steadily while he talked about plans that once felt limitless. Back then, he used to joke that she wrote like someone who believed every word deserved to be clear. Standing here now, years later, nothing about that habit had shifted. It was a small detail, easy for anyone else to overlook, but to Vernon it carried an unexpected sense of continuity, proof that not everything had been rewritten by time. So much around them had changed, cities, careers, entire directions of life, yet this one familiar trait remained untouched, and noticing it stirred something he hadn't prepared for. The realization that while he had spent years transforming himself into the man the world expected, parts of the person he once knew in her had stayed steady all along. By most public measures, Vernon Ebert was exactly the kind of success story business magazines like to feature. At 32, he led Ebert Innovations, one of the fastest rising tech companies in the country, known for making fast decisions and standing by them without hesitation. Investors trusted his judgment. Competitors paid attention when he entered a market. Employees described him as focused to the point of intensity. His days were mapped weeks in advance. Morning briefings, strategy calls, contract reviews that moved numbers large enough to shift entire departments with a single signature. Efficiency wasn't just part of his routine, it was the standard people expected whenever his name appeared on a schedule. In professional spaces, he spoke with calm certainty, rarely repeating himself, rarely needing to. That consistency built a reputation, reliable, precise, difficult to read. People respected him for what he had achieved in a short amount of time. Some kept their distance, unsure where professionalism ended and personal boundaries began. Very few could claim to know what he was like outside the role, because the version of Vernon most people encountered wasn't the young man who once shared late dinners and uncertain plans. It was the executive who had learned how to keep conversations brief, objectives clear, and emotions carefully out of sight. From the outside, it looked like control. From the inside, it was simply the person he had trained himself to become. Within his industry, Vernon's name carried a specific kind of weight. He was known for meetings that started on time and ended with clear decisions. No long detours, no vague promises, just direct questions followed by precise expectations. People learned quickly that if they came unprepared, he would notice. That efficiency earned him respect. It also created distance. Colleagues described him as fair but demanding, someone who valued results more than explanations. When negotiations grew tense, he didn't raise his voice, he simply went quiet, letting the silence do the work until the other side filled it. That habit unsettled people more than anger ever could. You always knew where you stood with him professionally. Deadlines were clear, standards were high, and excuses rarely changed outcomes. For many, that reliability made him someone they wanted leading the room. For others, it made him intimidating to approach without a solid reason. Either way, his presence shifted the tone of any space he entered. Conversations sharpened, postures straightened, decisions moved faster. It was the kind of authority built not from charm but from consistency. Years of proving that when Vernon Ebert committed to something, it would be executed exactly as promised. And over time, that reputation became the version of him the world recognized first, long before anyone considered who he might be when the workday ended. Vernon's calendar was planned with almost surgical precision. Weeks were divided into blocks, strategy sessions, investor updates, travel windows, review periods, each hour assigned before the previous one had even finished. Assistants coordinated across time zones so that very little was left to chance. Mornings often began before sunrise, with briefings sent to his tablet overnight. By the time most people reached their first coffee, he had already reviewed reports, approved adjustments, and flagged decisions that couldn't wait. Afternoons moved quickly. Back-to-back meetings where outcomes mattered more than discussion. Even transitions between locations were calculated, drivers waiting with routes optimized to avoid delays. Free time existed, but only in narrow gaps. Dinner reservations were scheduled days ahead. Calls with partners were slotted into late evenings, when other offices finally went quiet. If something unexpected appeared, it had to compete with a list already packed to capacity. The structure kept everything efficient. It also left very little room for anything unplanned. No wandering into small shops, no lingering conversations, no space for moments that didn't serve a clear objective. That level of control had helped him build a company at unusual speed. It had also meant that a simple stop inside a neighborhood bakery, unscheduled, unimportant on paper, stood out as the rare kind of interruption his life almost never allowed. As Ebert Innovations expanded, Vernon's world grew larger and more insulated. Trips that once meant early commercial flights and crowded terminals were replaced by quiet departures from private hangars. Travel became less about the journey and more about efficiency: arrive, meet, decide, move on. Cities started to blur together. Glass towers, reserved conference rooms, long tables where contracts were reviewed line by line before anyone reached for a pen. Those rooms were designed for clarity and leverage. Every seat had a purpose. Every conversation aimed toward an outcome measured in numbers, timelines, and market share. Vernon moved through them with practiced ease. He understood how to read hesitation across the table, when to push, when to wait, when silence would secure better terms than another argument. Agreements worth millions often came down to a few carefully chosen words and the confidence behind them. It was a world built on precision, comfortable, controlled, predictable. Yet the more time he spent in those environments, the less often he found himself in places where conversations weren't tied to performance or expectation, places where people spoke without calculating what they might gain. Standing in a small bakery earlier that day, surrounded by handwritten menus and the scent of fresh sugar, had felt almost unfamiliar compared to the polished spaces where most of his major decisions were made. And that contrast lingered longer than he expected. Over time, Vernon learned how to keep conversations efficient and himself slightly out of reach. It wasn't intentional at first. Long hours demanded focus, and focus left little room for personal details. Calls became shorter. Messages were answered with quick confirmations instead of full replies. Gradually, most interactions settled into a professional rhythm that rarely crossed into anything deeper. At work, that distance helped. Clear boundaries meant fewer misunderstandings. Expectations stayed sharp. People came to him with solutions instead of stories. Outside of work, though, the same habit followed him home. Dinners were often quiet, spent reviewing notes or preparing for the next day. Social events became appearances rather than connections. Handshakes, brief conversations, polite smiles that ended as soon as schedules pulled him elsewhere. He wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. The version of himself that once lingered in conversations, asked unnecessary questions, or stayed a little longer than required, had slowly been replaced by someone who moved on as soon as the objective was met. Most people around him accepted that as part of leadership, the natural cost of responsibility. Very few noticed that behind the composure was a man who had simply grown used to keeping his inner world private, not because he preferred isolation, but because efficiency had become easier than vulnerability. And after enough years, that distance stopped feeling temporary. It became normal. None of what Vernon had built came easily. Every promotion, every expansion, every breakthrough that pushed Ebert Innovations ahead of competitors had required something in return. Time first, then energy, then pieces of his life he once assumed he would circle back to later. Weekends disappeared into planning sessions. Birthdays were acknowledged with short calls instead of visits. Invitations were postponed so often that eventually they stopped arriving. At the time, each trade felt temporary. Work hard now, stabilize everything, then slow down. That had been the promise he repeated to himself during long nights and early flights. But success has a quiet way of raising the bar just as you reach it. One goal achieved opened the door to a larger one. Responsibilities grew, expectations followed, and the moment to finally ease up kept moving further ahead. From the outside, the results looked impressive. Rapid growth, strong headlines, a reputation built faster than most. From the inside, the path had been narrower than he admitted, because every hour invested in building that life had come from somewhere else. Conversations missed, relationships stretched thin, moments that didn't pause long enough for him to return. At first, he told himself the cost was manageable. Later, he stopped calculating it altogether, not because Vernon set out to break them, but because he kept believing he would come back and fix the timing later. A postponed visit here, a call he meant to return once things settled, assurances that the distance was only temporary. At first, people understood. Ambition requires focus, and those close to him had once supported the pace he chose. But time has a way of turning soon into too late. Conversations that used to happen daily became occasional check-ins. Occasional check-ins turned into long gaps filled with updates instead of real connection. Eventually, some of those relationships shifted into polite familiarity rather than closeness. One promise in particular stood out more than the others, the kind made during a season when everything still felt shared instead of divided. Back then, he had been certain he could build a future without losing what mattered most. Standing years later in a quiet bakery, face to face with someone who had once believed that promise with him, Vernon understood how easily good intentions can fade when priorities keep moving. Not with a dramatic break, just with enough missed moments that the distance becomes permanent, unless something unexpected brings it back into view. In public, Vernon's life looked complete. Profiles highlighted rapid growth, disciplined leadership, and a trajectory most people spent decades trying to reach. At conferences, introductions carried a note of respect. Panels invited him to speak about strategy, vision, and how to scale success without losing control. From the outside, it appeared he had assembled everything that signaled arrival: status, influence, measurable results. Applause came easily in those rooms. Then the events would end. Cars would pull away from brightly lit entrances. Conversations would taper off into brief goodbyes. And Vernon would return to spaces designed for comfort but rarely filled with company. His penthouse overlooked the city. Wide windows, clean lines, quiet that settled in as soon as the door closed. No deadlines followed him there. No expectations demanded immediate answers. Just stillness. It wasn't an unhappy silence, but it was empty in a way achievement couldn't fix. Because admiration, he had learned, is often loud in public and absent in private. It celebrates what you do, not necessarily who you share it with. And on most nights, once the calls were finished and the day's decisions were already in motion, Vernon found himself surrounded by everything he had worked for. Without anyone nearby who remembered the version of him that existed before any of it began. In most rooms, Vernon was introduced the same way. Everyone, this is Vernon Ebert, CEO of Ebert Innovations. A handshake followed, respectful nods, conversations that immediately shifted to performance, growth, projections. No one asked what he did when he wasn't working. Because truthfully, there wasn't much to report. One evening after a late strategy session, a junior executive had tried to lighten the mood while they waited for the elevator. "Sir, do you ever actually switch off?" Vernon had given a faint, polite smile. "I scheduled time to..." The doors opened. The conversation ended there. Another time during a networking dinner, someone raised a glass and said, "To Vernon, the man who never misses a target." People laughed, impressed. Vernon nodded in appreciation. No one noticed he didn't add anything back. Moments like that happened often. Rooms full of recognition, conversations built around results, respect that never quite crossed into familiarity. Years earlier, someone had once teased him over cheap coffee. "You know, you're easier to read when you're not trying so hard to be impressive." Back then, he had laughed it off. Now, standing alone in spaces designed for comfort, he realized how rare it had become for anyone to speak to him without filtering their words through his title first. Plenty of people knew his reputation. Plenty could list his achievements. But the number of people who actually knew Vernon, the version without the schedule, without the expectations, without the carefully managed composure, had grown quietly, steadily smaller, until, without him fully noticing when it happened, there were almost none left. There had been a time when Vernon believed the pace was only for a season. Just a few intense years, he used to say, half smiling as he closed his laptop late at night. "Once things stabilize, I'll slow down." Back then, the long hours felt like an investment, not a trade. He remembered sitting across from Alessia in a small cafe near campus, both of them surrounded by open notebooks and plans that seemed larger than their current reality. "You're going to do big things," she had told him, stirring her coffee. "I know you will." He had grinned, energized by the certainty in her voice. "And when I do," he replied, "we'll finally have breathing room." She studied him for a second, not doubting his ambition, just measuring it. "Just promise me something," she said quietly. "What?" "Don't lose yourself while you're trying to become someone impressive." At the time, he laughed it off with easy confidence. "I won't." It had sounded simple. Temporary sacrifice, future balance. But success rarely arrives with a finish line. One milestone led to a larger one. Each achievement brought new expectations, new responsibilities, new reasons to keep pushing a little longer. The slowdown he promised himself kept moving further ahead, always just beyond the next deal, the next expansion, the next quarter that needed his full attention. Years passed that way, and somewhere between progress reports and overnight flights, that early promise, made across a table with cheap coffee and honest intentions, stopped being part of his daily decisions. Not because he rejected it, because he never paused long enough to return to it. Most nights ended the same way. Vernon would step into his penthouse well past dark, the city still alive below but muted behind thick glass. The lights came on automatically as he crossed the room, illuminating a space that was spotless, modern, and almost too quiet. He would set his phone on the counter, loosen his tie, and glance at the notifications that had stacked up during the last meeting. Missed calls. Messages marked urgent. A few personal names that had learned to keep their texts short. One evening his phone buzzed again just as he poured a glass of water. "Mom, call me when you're free. I'll call in the morning," he muttered to himself, already knowing the morning would be filled before it began. Another time, a former college friend had left a voicemail. Casual, hopeful. Vernon had listened to it while reviewing a contract, then saved it to return later. Later never came. The apartment held no reminders, no clutter, nothing out of place. Everything was designed for comfort, yet nothing suggested someone actually lived a full life there, just a place to rest between obligations. He would stand by the window sometimes, looking out over rows of lights stretching across the city. From that height, everything appeared calm. Inside, the silence settled in quickly once the last email was sent. No conversation drifting from another room, no small interruptions asking how his day went. Just a low hum of climate control and the faint glow of a screen waiting for the next task. It wasn't a harsh loneliness, more like a space that had never been filled with anything personal long enough to leave an imprint, and after enough nights like that, the quiet stopped feeling unusual. It simply became the way his life sounded when work was done. Of all the commitments Vernon had postponed over the years, one stood out with uncomfortable clarity. It wasn't written in any contract. It had been spoken across a small table, late enough in the evening that the cafe was nearly empty. "I'll come back once things settle," he had told her, confident in a future he believed he could control. "This is just the hard part before everything gets easier." Alessia had studied him quietly, not doubting his drive, only the timeline. "How long is just the hard part?" she asked. "A year," he said without hesitation. "Maybe less." She nodded, accepting the answer because she trusted the person giving it. "I can wait," she replied softly. "Just don't disappear on me." At the time, that promise felt easy to keep. Calls were regular at first, quick updates between meetings, late-night conversations where he described progress, and she filled in the details of her day. They laughed about how busy life had become, convinced the distance was temporary. Then schedules tightened, calls shifted to messages, messages turned into brief check-ins. Eventually days passed without contact, then weeks. He remembered one evening when his phone lit up with her name while he was walking into a conference room. He glanced at it, hesitated, and whispered, "I'll call right after this." The meeting ran long. Another started. By the time he checked again, the screen was dark. There was no argument, no dramatic ending, just fewer conversations. Until there were none. Standing years later in that bakery, watching her move with calm confidence beside her daughter, Vernon understood that the promise hadn't been broken in a single moment. It had faded through a series of small delays he kept telling himself he would fix soon. Soon, it turned out, had simply never arrived. At industry events, Vernon was rarely alone. People gathered easily. Partners wanting a moment of his time, founders hoping for advice, reporters waiting for a concise quote. The attention was constant, polished and respectful. One evening at a formal reception, a host tapped a glass to get everyone's attention. "Before we continue," he said with a smile, "let's acknowledge the man who closed the fastest expansion deal this year, Vernon Ebert." Applause followed. Heads turned. A few people raised their glasses in his direction. Vernon inclined his head, offering the practiced expression he used in public. Appreciative, composed, controlled. As the noise settled, someone beside him said, half impressed, half curious, "Must feel good, having everyone know your name." Vernon answered with a polite nod. "It's been a productive year." The conversation moved on quickly. Next topic, next opportunity, next introduction. Hours later, the event ended the way they all did. Valet lines, brief goodbyes, promises to reconnect that rarely turned into anything personal. Back home, the elevator opened into his quiet floor. No applause, no voices, just the soft click of the door closing behind him. He set his keys on the counter and loosened his cuff, the room greeting him with the same steady silence it always held. Public admiration had a way of filling spaces with energy. Private spaces, he had learned, held only what you actually brought back with you. And most nights, what followed him home wasn't conversation or laughter, just the echo of a day spent being known for what he did, rather than who he was with. Over time, Vernon noticed a pattern in how people spoke to him. Conversations were respectful, efficient, often careful, measured in a way that kept everything professional and safe. Jokes were polite, questions stayed surface level. No one lingered long enough to wander into anything personal. It wasn't that people disliked him, they simply related to the version of him that came with a title. He had become someone others approached with preparation rather than familiarity. Years earlier, there had been people who spoke to him without hesitation, who interrupted his thoughts, challenged his ideas, laughed when he took himself too seriously. People who knew what he sounded like when he wasn't trying to sound certain. Standing in that bakery earlier, hearing his name spoken without any formality attached to it, had brought that contrast into sharp focus. There had been no title. Just Vernon, simple, direct, unfiltered. He realized then how rare that had become. Plenty of people could describe his achievements. Many could list the milestones, the deals, the reputation he had built. But the number of people who actually knew him, the version without schedules, without expectations, without the careful distance, had narrowed over the years to almost no one. And the few who once did had been left behind in the process of becoming someone the world would recognize. For years, Vernon had treated the cost of his ambition like a short-term investment. Work harder now, miss a few things, make up for it later. That had been the plan. He remembered saying it more than once, sometimes out loud, sometimes only to himself while boarding another late flight. Just a little longer, he would think. Once everything's secure, I'll have time again. Time for people. Time for the parts of life that didn't show up on performance reports. No introduction. But success doesn't arrive with a moment where someone taps your shoulder and says you can finally slow down. It keeps asking for attention. And if you keep answering, years pass before you notice how much has quietly slipped away. Standing in Sweet Haven Bakery earlier that day, watching Alessia write his order with the same steady handwriting he remembered, that old assumption finally cracked. The pace hadn't been temporary. The distance hadn't been brief. It had simply become his life. And in that warm, unhurried space, far removed from boardrooms and polished conference tables, Vernon felt, perhaps for the first time in years, the full weight of what his success had actually cost him. Not in numbers, in moments, in people, in the version of himself that once believed he could chase the future without losing the past along the way. Years earlier, before boardrooms and investor calls, Vernon's world was much smaller and far less predictable. Back then, success meant passing exams, stretching a tight budget, and finding coffee strong enough to survive late study nights. The memory returned not as a dramatic shift, but like a familiar place he hadn't visited in a long time. A campus courtyard, warm afternoon light, voices overlapping in easy conversation. That was where he first met Alessia. She was sitting on the edge of a fountain, flipping through a thick notebook filled with color-coded tabs. Vernon had stopped nearby, scanning a campus map with growing frustration. "Let me guess," she said without looking up. "You're either lost or pretending you're not." He glanced at her, slightly defensive. "I'm not lost." She finally met his eyes, amused. "Then why are you holding the map upside down?" He turned it. "Okay, maybe a little lost." She smiled. Business building is that way. That was the first time he heard her laugh. They started talking because it was convenient. They kept talking because it was easy. Both of them had plans bigger than their current reality. "I don't want a normal job," Vernon admitted one evening. Alessia closed her notebook. "Good. Normal sounds expensive and boring." He laughed. "You say that now. I'll say it later too," she replied. "I just want a life that actually feels like mine." That sentence stayed with him longer than most conversations from that year. Their dates were rarely planned. Usually it was whoever texted first. Coffee? The cafe near campus had chipped mugs and slow service, but they stayed for hours. One night, Vernon complained about the bitter taste. "This coffee is terrible," Alessia shrugged. "It's $2, so your expectations are too expensive." He smirked. "When I'm successful, I'm buying better coffee." She leaned forward. "When you're successful, you're still buying mine. Deal." Alessia had a way of slowing him down without trying to. When he talked too fast about future plans, she'd raise a brow. "You're already running," she said once. "You haven't even started yet. I'm preparing. You're sprinting in place." He rolled his eyes, but he smiled. She never discouraged his ambition. She just made sure it didn't consume every conversation. Their routine started overlapping naturally. Study sessions turned into dinners. Dinners turned into late walks back to the dorms. One evening, sitting on the steps outside the library, she nudged his shoulder. "You know you don't have to prove everything all the time. I do if I want to get ahead." She shook her head lightly. "You're already enough without the pressure." No one had ever said that to him before. They spoke often about later, where they'd live, what work would look like, whether success meant money or freedom. "I want to build something big," Vernon said. Alessia nodded. "Then build it." "That's it?" "That's it," she smiled. "Just don't forget who you are while you're busy becoming impressive." He laughed at the phrasing. Years later, he would remember every word. Opportunities began appearing. Internships, competitions, connections with people already established. Vernon leaned into them immediately. More meetings, more late nights, more pressure. Alessia noticed the shift first. "You're checking your email during dinner," she said once. "It's important. So is eating while your food is still warm." He put the phone down, reluctantly. Even as things grew busier, their humor remained. During finals week, Vernon was stressed beyond reason. "I think my brain stopped working," he muttered. Alessia handed him a snack. "Here, emergency fuel. This is a granola bar. Exactly. Premium brain technology." He laughed despite himself. Moments like that kept him balanced, whether he admitted it or not. Near graduation, a major opportunity appeared, one that required relocation and full commitment. It was everything Vernon had been working toward. He told her late at night, excitement barely contained. This could change everything. Alessia listened carefully. "I know," she said. "You're not upset? I'm proud of you, no hesitation, just support." Reality followed quickly. "It's only temporary," Vernon assured her. "A year, maybe less." Alessia searched his face. "You promise you won't disappear into work?" "I won't." She nodded slowly. "Then go build your future." Before he left, they sat in the same cafe where most of their memories lived. He reached across the table. "This is just the beginning for us." Alessia squeezed his hand. "Then don't let success turn you into someone I don't recognize. It won't." At the time, he believed that completely. At first, they spoke constantly. Late calls, shared updates, small jokes, then schedules tightened. Calls became shorter. Texts replaced conversations. One evening, her name appeared on his phone before a meeting. "I'll call after," he whispered. He didn't. There was no big argument, no harsh words, just increasing distance, days without contact, then weeks. Eventually, silence that felt too long to fix with a casual message. The relationship didn't explode. It simply slipped out of reach. Back then, Vernon believed he was stepping away for a short time so he could return stronger. Standing years later in a small bakery, watching the woman he once shared cheap coffee and oversized dreams with gently wipe frosting from her daughter's cheek, he understood the truth he hadn't faced before. He hadn't just left a place. He had left a life that once knew him better than success ever would. Victoria Langford entered Vernon's life the way most things did at that stage, through proximity, timing, and shared professional circles. They first met at a leadership summit, hosted in a glass-walled venue overlooking the city. She had been part of a panel discussing brand expansion strategies, speaking with calm confidence and sharp clarity that immediately drew attention. After the session, Vernon approached her near the refreshment table. "You made a strong case for long-term positioning," he said. Victoria smiled, recognizing the tone of someone used to evaluating ideas quickly. "And you asked the only question that actually challenged it," she replied. "Most people just nod and take notes." It was an easy first exchange, mutual respect, no awkwardness. Their next conversation happened weeks later at a private networking dinner. This time it lasted longer. They discovered overlapping schedules, similar expectations, and the shared understanding that success often required uncomfortable hours. "You travel a lot?" she asked. "More than I planned to," Vernon admitted. She lifted her glass slightly. "Then at least you understand. Airport coffee is a survival tool." He smirked. "I've learned not to complain about it anymore." From the beginning, their connection was built on compatibility rather than intensity. Victoria was composed, intelligent, and socially effortless in rooms where reputation mattered. She understood how to navigate high-level conversations without needing explanation, and she never seemed intimidated by pressure. With her, everything flowed logically. Dinners were scheduled in advance. Conversations stayed focused. Decisions were discussed like strategy sessions, clear, practical, efficient. There was comfort in that structure. No misunderstandings, no emotional guessing, just two people whose lives aligned on paper. Introductions often sounded the same. "Vernon, you remember Victoria, Langford Consulting." "Of course. And you two are working together now?" Victoria would answer smoothly, in more ways than one. It earned approving smiles. They looked right standing side by side, well-dressed, confident, equally respected. Colleagues described them as a strong match. No one questioned it. The relationship progressed the way well-organized plans usually do, step by step, without disruption. There were no dramatic highs, but there were also no conflicts. Even their disagreements sounded measured. One evening over dinner, Victoria reviewed his upcoming travel calendar. "You're in Seattle Monday, Chicago Thursday, back here Sunday? That's the plan." She nodded. "We'll schedule the engagement announcement after the Chicago meetings. The timing will work better for press coverage." Vernon paused briefly, then agreed. All right. It made sense. Everything with Victoria made sense. She was thoughtful without being overly emotional, supportive without demanding constant attention. She understood that work sometimes came first because her own career followed the same pattern. There was no tension about priorities, only coordination. When Vernon proposed, it wasn't impulsive. It happened after a quiet dinner at a private restaurant where the staff knew them by name. He placed the ring box on the table between them. I think this is the next logical step, he said. Victoria looked at the ring, then at him. You're certain? I believe we build well together. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring the sincerity behind the words. Then she smiled, calm, composed. Yes, she said, we do. There were no tears, no dramatic embrace, just a mutual decision acknowledged with quiet confidence. The engagement announcement was received exactly as expected. Congratulations filled their inboxes. Industry contacts sent polite messages. One partner joked during a call. Power couple confirmed. Victoria handled the public side with ease, selecting venues, coordinating guest lists, ensuring every detail reflected the image they both represented. Their future looked organized, predictable, impressive. Yet in private moments, Vernon occasionally noticed something he couldn't quite define, conversations that stayed productive yet rarely personal. One night, as they reviewed seating arrangements, Victoria asked, "Do you prefer the indoor reception or the terrace version?" "Whichever works best," he replied. She studied him briefly. "You don't have a preference?" He considered the question, then shook his head. "Both are fine." She nodded and returned to the list. Nothing was wrong. Nothing felt tense. And still there were moments when the relationship felt more like a well-run partnership than something deeply rooted. Not empty, just practical. On paper, it was ideal. Shared ambition, shared standards, shared understanding of how demanding success could be. Friends described them as balanced. Professional peers called the match strategic. Even Vernon admitted to himself that marrying Victoria would simplify many parts of his life. The path ahead would be stable, respected, predictable. Exactly the kind of future he had spent years building toward. Which was why, standing in Sweet Haven Bakery days later, hearing Alessia's voice and watching a small child proudly defend chocolate cake, the certainty he had carried about his engagement didn't feel as solid as it once had. For the first time since saying yes to that next step, a quiet question surfaced beneath all the logic. Was choosing what made sense the same as choosing what actually felt right? 2 days later, Vernon told himself he was only stopping by to confirm the pickup details. That was the official reason, the one that fit neatly into his schedule. Still, as the car slowed near Sweet Haven Bakery, he found himself checking the time, even though he already knew he had allowed more than enough of it. Inside, the bell chimed softly as he stepped through the door. He hadn't made it 3 steps before a small voice rang out from near the display case. "Cake man!" Vernon looked down to see Brittany standing on her tiptoes, both hands pressed against the glass as if she had been keeping watch. A surprised laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "That's my official title now?" She nodded with complete confidence. "Yes." Alessia glanced up from behind the counter, clearly caught between embarrassment and amusement. "Brittany," she said gently, "you can't assign people permanent names." "I can if they buy cake," the girl replied, completely serious. Vernon crouched slightly so he was closer to her level. "I guess that makes sense," he said. "It's a very important purchase." Brittany studied him, satisfied he understood the responsibility. Alessia shook her head lightly, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she reached for a small plate. "I saved a sample from yesterday," she said, "in case you wanted to make sure the flavor was right." She slid a neat slice of chocolate cake across the counter. Vernon accepted it, more aware than he expected of how informal the moment felt compared to his usual meetings. He took a bite. The flavor was rich without being overwhelming, balanced in a way that felt deliberate rather than flashy. "Wow," he said honestly. "This is really good." Brittany crossed her arms proudly. "Told you." He laughed again, softer this time. "I should have trusted your expertise." "I'm the quality manager," she informed him. Alessia covered a small laugh with her hand. "Self-appointed," she clarified. The easy exchange settled into the space like it belonged there. No pressure, no history pressing in. Just a man tasting cake while a 4-year-old took her role very seriously. Vernon rested his forearms lightly against the counter, noticing how natural it felt to linger instead of rushing through the interaction. In his world, pauses usually meant something had gone wrong. Here, they simply existed. Brittany leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing confidential information. "Chocolate is the best one. Vanilla is—" "Okay, I'll remember that," Vernon said. "Very important data." She nodded, pleased. For a moment his attention shifted to Alessia. She was watching the exchange quietly, expression calm but softer than during their first meeting. There was no tension in her posture, just a steady awareness of someone used to balancing work and parenting at the same time. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed. Still, something unspoken moved between them, recognition of how different this moment felt from the last time he had stood here. "Will you come to my birthday?" The question landed so directly it caught him off guard. Alessia froze behind the counter. "Brittany," she started, clearly unsure whether to stop her or apologize. Vernon looked down at the small hand wrapped around his fingers. When is it? He asked gently. Next week, she said, eyes bright with expectation. His mind automatically reached for his calendar, packed meetings, travel blocks, commitments already confirmed. Then he looked back at her face, hopeful, certain, completely unconcerned with how complicated adult schedules could be. I'll try my best, he said. I knew you would, she replied immediately, as if the answer had never been in doubt. The confidence in her voice settled somewhere deeper than he expected. Alessia exhaled slowly, a mix of gratitude and caution crossing her expression. You don't have to feel obligated, she said quietly. I know, Vernon replied. I just want to. The admission surprised even him. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Brittany released his hand and returned to inspecting the display case, already narrating her favorites under her breath. Vernon straightened, brushing a crumb from his sleeve. Thank you for the cake, he said to Alessia. You're welcome. Their conversation paused again, balanced between familiarity and distance. For a brief moment, everything felt strangely simple. No titles, no expectations. Just three people standing in a small bakery that smelled like sugar and warm bread. As Vernon turned toward the door, Brittany called after him. Bye, cake man. He glanced back, unable to hide his smile. See you soon, quality manager. She beamed. Outside, the city noise returned the second the door closed behind him. Cars passed, phones buzzed. The pace of his usual world rushed back into place. Yet as he walked toward the waiting car, he realized something had shifted. The meeting had lasted less than 15 minutes. No contracts, no negotiations, no measurable outcome. And still, it lingered in his mind longer than most conversations he'd had all week, because for those few minutes inside Sweet Haven Bakery, nothing about his presence had been tied to performance or expectation. He had simply been someone a child was excited to see again. That night, Vernon returned to his penthouse later than usual. The elevator doors opened directly into the living space, revealing the same clean lines, soft lighting, and carefully arranged furniture that had impressed him when he first moved in. From the windows, the city stretched outward in precise rows of light, distant and orderly. Normally, the view helped him reset after long days. He set his keys on the counter and loosened his cuff, the quiet settling in almost immediately. No background conversation, no television left running. Just the low hum of climate control and the faint vibration of his phone against the marble surface. The small velvet ring box sat exactly where he had left it earlier that morning, centered, undisturbed. He hadn't meant to notice it first, still his eyes went straight to it. For a moment he simply stood there, jacket still on, as if approaching it required more effort than it should have. 2 weeks. That was all that remained before the wedding. Everything had been arranged, venue, guest list, announcements already drafted. From the outside, the next step in his life looked settled and impressive. He reached for the box and turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of something so small holding so much expectation, just like everything else about the plan. Perfect, he muttered, though the word lacked conviction. He closed the box again and set it back down. Without thinking, his mind replayed the afternoon at the bakery, the warm air, the scent of sugar, the sound of a child declaring chocolate superior with complete authority. Silence filled the space. My mommy runs this bakery. The pride in Brittany's voice echoed clearly. Vernon exhaled slowly, resting his hands against the counter. His life was full of impressive spaces, boardrooms with polished tables, private lounges, offices high above the city. When he opened it, the ring caught the overhead light. Precise, elegant, flawless. Good. I finalized the seating layout today. We'll review it tomorrow. Yet none of them carried the kind of warmth packed into that small shop. His phone buzzed. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. He answered. Hey, he said. Did you confirm the cake? She asked, tone calm, efficient as always. Yes, you sound tired, she added. All right. A brief pause followed, long enough to notice, not long enough to call awkward. Long day. Get some rest, she said. We've got a full week ahead. Yeah. The call ended with the same smooth politeness it always did. No tension, no warmth either, just coordination. Vernon set the phone down and walked toward the window, looking out over the city again. From this height, everything seemed controlled, traffic moving in steady lines, lights blinking in predictable patterns. He tried to focus on the advantages of the life he had built. Security, respect, momentum that showed no sign of slowing. This was what he had worked toward for years. So why did the quiet feel heavier tonight? He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, trying to shake the lingering thoughts. It didn't work. Instead, another memory surfaced, Brittany's small hand gripping his without hesitation. I knew you would. The certainty in her voice had been effortless. Uncalculated, just trust offered freely. He pushed away from the window and crossed the room, stopping near the dining table set for one. The place was immaculate, untouched, more decorative than functional most nights. He pulled out the chair, sat, then stood again almost immediately. Restlessness replaced the usual end-of-day fatigue. Everything in this apartment was designed for comfort. None of it made him feel settled. His gaze drifted back to the counter. The ring box sat exactly where he had left it, unmoved, waiting. He walked over, resting his fingertips beside it rather than picking it up this time. For years he had made decisions quickly. Analyze, choose, execute. This one should have been simple. Was he about to marry Victoria because he truly wanted that life? Or because it fit neatly with the one he had already built? The difference had never seemed important before. Now it did. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the still room. Success had given him control over almost every variable: time, resources, outcomes. Yet standing there in the silence, he realized there was one thing it hadn't guaranteed: clarity. Across the city, somewhere beyond the rows of lights, a small bakery would be closing for the night. Chairs stacked, counters wiped down, tomorrow's dough prepared in advance. A place filled with conversation, small laughter, and the kind of ordinary moments his schedule rarely allowed. The contrast lingered longer than he expected. Vernon looked once more at the ring box, then turned away without opening it again. For the first time since setting the wedding date, the future he had planned so carefully no longer felt inevitable. It felt negotiable. Instead, a quiet question pressed forward, persistent enough that ignoring it required effort. And that realization stayed with him long after the apartment lights dimmed and the city outside finally began to quiet. The next time Vernon returned to Sweet Haven Bakery, the afternoon crowd had already thinned. Only one customer stood near the register, collecting a small box tied with ribbon. The air carried the familiar scent of warm sugar and fresh bread, grounding in a way he hadn't expected to need. Brittany spotted him first. "Cake man!" Her voice bounced across the room before he could say a word. He smiled automatically. "I see the title stuck. It's permanent," she confirmed. Alessia glanced up from behind the counter, surprise flickering briefly across her face before settling into that same calm composure she seemed to carry naturally. "You're back," she said. "Just had some time," he replied, aware of how unusual that sounded coming from him. Brittany leaned closer over the counter. "Did you practice remembering chocolate is the best?" "I reviewed the data carefully," Vernon said. "Your recommendation still holds." She nodded, satisfied, then wandered toward a small table where crayons were scattered beside a coloring book. The bakery grew quieter. For a few moments, neither adult spoke. Finally, Alessia gestured toward the back hallway. "Give me a minute," she said softly. "Can you keep an eye on her?" "Of course," Brittany hummed to herself while coloring, completely absorbed. Alessia wiped her hands on a towel and motioned toward the back door. Vernon followed. Outside, the late afternoon air felt cooler, carrying the faint sounds of passing cars and distant conversation from the street. The space behind the bakery was simple. Delivery crates stacked neatly, a narrow alley catching the last stretch of sunlight. Alessia leaned lightly against the wall, arms folded. Not defensive, just steady. "You didn't come back just to confirm cake details," she said. "No," Vernon admitted. He took a breath, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "I'm getting married in 2 weeks," he said. "It should feel right." She listened without interruption. "But it doesn't," he finished quietly. Alessia's expression didn't change much, but her eyes softened slightly. "Happiness isn't loud," she said. "It's usually something small you protect every day." The sentence landed deeper than he expected. "I used to have that," he said, voice lower. "With you," silence stretched between them. Not tense, just full. Alessia looked down briefly, then back up. "I found out I was pregnant a month after you moved." For a second, Vernon didn't process the words. They seemed to hang in the air, separate from everything else. Then meaning settled in. His chest tightened. "Brittany?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Alessia nodded once. "Yes." The world didn't spin or crash. It simply went very still. 7 years compressed into a single realization. He exhaled slowly, one hand moving to the back of his neck as if grounding himself. "She's mine?" Another small nod. No accusation, no anger. Just truth, finally spoken. A wave of emotions followed. Shock first, then something heavier. Guilt, wonder, a quiet ache for moments that had already passed. "I should have been there," he said, the words rough. Alessia shook her head gently. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's just what happened." He leaned back against the wall, staring at the ground for a moment. Images surfaced without permission. Brittany's proud smile, her small hand gripping his earlier. the way she had spoken with effortless trust. All the ordinary moments he had missed, first steps, first words, birthdays he never knew existed. "How did you manage?" he asked quietly. "The same way most people do," Alessia said. "One day at a time, no drama, no resentment, just quiet strength." That steadiness hit him harder than anger would have. Inside the bakery, Brittany's voice floated faintly through the door, humming to herself. Vernon swallowed. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Alessia replied. "This isn't something that gets fixed in one conversation." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. For years he had believed every problem had a solution if approached correctly. This wasn't a problem. It was a reality, one that had existed without him. "I missed everything," he said, more to himself than to her. "You missed the beginning," she said gently. "That doesn't mean you have to miss the rest." The possibility in that sentence settled between them, quiet but unmistakable. He looked toward the door where Brittany's faint humming continued. For the first time since hearing the truth, something shifted inside him, not relief, not resolution. Responsibility, and beneath it, an unfamiliar sense of wonder, a daughter. The word felt both foreign and deeply personal at the same time. "I don't want to walk away again," he said. Alessia studied him for a moment, measuring sincerity the way someone does after learning to rely on actions more than promises. "Then don't," she said simply. No grand speech, no conditions, just a choice placed back in his hands. From inside, Brittany called out, "Mommy, I used the purple." Alessia smiled despite herself. "I should get back." Vernon nodded, still absorbing everything. As they moved toward the door, he paused briefly, hand resting against the frame. 7 years ago, he had walked away from a life he thought would wait. Now he stood at the edge of something he hadn't known existed, one that had grown, changed, and continued without him. When they stepped back inside, Brittany looked up immediately. "Did you get in trouble?" she asked Vernon with serious concern. He managed a small, genuine smile. "No," he said softly. "I think I just learned something important." She considered that, then nodded, as if that was an acceptable outcome. And in that simple acceptance, the weight in his chest shifted, not gone but no longer hollow. Because for the first time, in years, Vernon wasn't standing between his past and his future. He was standing in the middle of something that could still become real, if he chose not to walk away again. Vernon asked Victoria to meet that evening at a quiet restaurant they had used before, one of those places where conversation stayed private and the staff understood when not to interrupt. She arrived exactly on time, composed as always, setting her phone beside her plate before looking across the table. "You sounded serious on the call," she said. "Is everything all right?" Vernon nodded once, though the motion lacked its usual certainty. "I needed to talk to you in person." The waiter approached, but Victoria lifted a hand politely. "Just water for now." When they were alone again, she studied his expression more closely. "You look like you've already made a decision about something." He exhaled slowly. "I have." There was no easy way to begin, so he chose the most honest one. "I care about you," he said. "I respect you. Working with you, being with you, has always been steady." Victoria listened without interrupting, her posture straight but not defensive. "But I realized something this week," he continued. "I'm not marrying you for the right reason." The words settled between them without raising his voice or hers. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she held his gaze, processing. "Because it makes sense," she said quietly. "Yes, no argument, just acknowledgement." A faint, almost tired smile touched her lips. "I wondered if we might reach this point," she admitted. That caught him off guard. "You did?" Victoria folded her hands on the table. "We work well together," she said. "Our lives align. Our goals don't conflict." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But alignment isn't the same as depth." Vernon felt the truth of that settle heavily. "I should have been honest with myself sooner," he said. "You're being honest now," she replied. "That counts for something." Silence followed, but it wasn't hostile. It felt reflective. After a moment, Victoria asked, "Is there someone else?" Vernon didn't rush the answer. "There's someone from my past," he said, "and a situation I didn't know about until recently." She nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning without pressing for details. "That explains the shift," she said. "I didn't plan for any of this," he added. "No one ever does," she replied. Another quiet pause. Then Victoria leaned back slightly, her expression calm but sincere. "If you married me because it was convenient," she said, "we'd both feel it eventually. Vernon didn't argue, because he knew she was right. I don't want to start a life built on something halfway, she continued. And you don't seem like the kind of man who does either. He met her eyes. I'm sorry. She shook her head once. Don't apologize for telling the truth before it's too late. The waiter approached again, hesitated, then stepped back when he sensed the moment. Victoria reached for her glass of water, taking a slow sip. When were you planning to tell people? She asked. I hadn't thought that far. Then we'll handle it quietly, she said. No unnecessary attention, even now practical, composed, the same qualities that had made their relationship work. Vernon felt a deep respect settle in. You deserve someone who's fully present, he said. Victoria gave a small, genuine smile. And so do you. There was no anger in her voice. Only acceptance. They sat there a moment longer, the reality of the conversation settling into place, not dramatic, not explosive, just two adults recognizing a truth neither could ignore. Finally, Victoria gathered her phone. I think ending this now is the kindest option for both of us, she said. I agree. She stood, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket. For what it's worth, she added, I never doubted your integrity. I just think you finally listened to something you were trying to ignore. He rose as well. Thank you for handling this the way you are. Victoria offered her hand. He shook it. Formal, respectful, final. Take care of whatever you need to fix, she said. And do it properly. I will. She gave one last nod, then turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. No scene, no raised voices, just a quiet ending that left no bitterness behind. Vernon remained standing for a moment after she left, the chair across from him empty, the future he had planned shifting into something uncertain, but honest. For the first time since the wedding had been scheduled, the path ahead no longer felt like an obligation he had to fulfill. It felt like a choice, and as he stepped out into the night air, he realized something that hadn't been clear before. Ending something that made sense on paper had not made him feel like he had lost stability. It made him feel, unexpectedly, lighter, not because the decision was easy, but because it was finally real. The next time Vernon walked towards Sweet Haven Bakery, he didn't arrive in a pressed suit or step out of a waiting car. He parked a few blocks away and came the rest of the distance on foot. No assistant, no schedule notification buzzing in his pocket, just the late afternoon air and the quiet awareness that this visit wasn't something he could treat like another item on a checklist. Through the front window, he could see movement behind the counter. Alessia arranging a tray, Brittany perched on a stool with her feet swinging. For a second, he hesitated outside the door. Not because he wanted to leave, because this time he understood the weight of simply being present. The bell chimed as he stepped inside. Brittany looked up first. Her face lit instantly. Cake man! The excitement in her voice carried across the room before he had taken 2 steps. Vernon smiled, genuine, unguarded. I think I'm getting used to that name. She hopped off the stool and ran toward him without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his leg in a quick, enthusiastic hug. The gesture was so natural it caught him off balance, not physically but emotionally. He rested a careful hand on her shoulder. Hey, he said softly. Alessia watched from behind the counter, surprise flickering across her expression before settling into something quieter. Relief mixed with caution. You didn't have to come back, she said. I know, Vernon replied. I wanted to. He stepped closer, resting his hands lightly against the counter. I ended the engagement. The words hung there, simple, direct. Alessia's brows drew together slightly. You didn't have to do that because of us. I didn't, he said. I did it because it wasn't honest. That distinction mattered. She studied him for a moment, searching his face for the kind of certainty that can't be performed. Brittany tugged at his hand. Look, she said, pulling him toward a small table covered in paper. A messy collection of crayon drawings spread across the surface, bright colors, uneven shapes, enthusiastic effort. This one is our bakery, she announced proudly. Vernon crouched beside her. The drawing showed a square building, a large sun, and 3 stick figures holding what looked like cupcakes. Who's that? He asked, pointing. That's Mommy. And this one? Me. He hesitated before asking about the third. And this? Brittany answered without pause. That's you. The simplicity of it hit harder than any complicated conversation. He swallowed, a quiet warmth settling in his chest. I look very tall, he said gently. You are, she confirmed. Behind them, Alessia turned slightly, giving them space while pretending to reorganize the counter. Vernon stood again, brushing his hands together lightly. I don't expect anything to change overnight, he said to her. I just want to be here, however that looks. Alessia leaned against the counter, arms loosely folded, not closed off, just thoughtful. Showing up is a start, she said. I can do that. Brittany slipped her hand into his again, as if that agreement had already been approved. "Are you coming to my birthday?" she asked. "I cleared my schedule," he replied. Her eyes widened. "You did?" "I did." She nodded with deep satisfaction, as though this confirmed he was finally making sensible decisions. The moments settled into an easy quiet. No pressure, no dramatic declarations, just the steady presence of three people standing in a space that smelled like sugar and warm bread. Vernon glanced around the bakery, the handwritten menu, the small jars of sprinkles, the soft hum of an oven cycling down. It wasn't impressive in the way his usual environments were. It was better, because here nothing required him to perform. He could simply exist. Brittany tugged his sleeve again. "Can you help me put more sprinkles on?" Alessia gave a small smile. "As long as you accept responsibility for the mess, I think I can handle that," he said. Brittany handed him a small container with complete trust. As he carefully shook a few sprinkles across a cupcake, several missed and scattered across the table. Brittany gasped. "You dropped some." "I did. That's okay," she decided after a second. "We'll fix it." Vernon laughed quietly. "Good plan." Alessia watched the exchange, something in her expression softening in a way that hadn't been there during their first meeting. Not forgiveness, not yet, but openness. Time passed without anyone checking the clock. No one rushed the moment. Eventually, Vernon set the sprinkle jar down and looked between them. Alessia steady, Brittany content, the bakery wrapped in late afternoon light. For years, his life had been measured in progress reports and deadlines. Standing here with sugar on his sleeve and a child explaining proper sprinkle distribution, he felt something settle inside him that had been restless for a long time. Not excitement, not relief, belonging, small, quiet, real. And for the first time since discovering the truth, he understood that redemption wasn't a grand gesture or a single decision. It was this: returning, staying, choosing again and again not to walk away. 6 months didn't transform Vernon's life overnight. It changed it quietly, in ways that only became obvious when compared to how things used to be. His office still overlooked the city, the same wide windows framing rows of buildings stretching toward the horizon. Ebert Innovations continued to grow, meetings still filled his mornings, and decisions still carried weight. But his calendar looked different now. Blocks that once stretched late into the evening ended earlier. Certain days, previously open for flexible scheduling, were no longer available at all. One assistant had asked carefully during a weekly review, "Should I keep Thursdays open moving forward?" "Yes," Vernon replied. "Those are non-negotiable." No explanation followed. He simply meant it. On those afternoons, he could often be found standing in a small school gym that smelled faintly of polished wood and crayons, watching children run across the floor with more enthusiasm than coordination. "Cake Man!" The name had stayed. She would wave with both arms, as if there were any chance he might miss her. He always waved back. Sometimes other parents glanced at him, recognition flickering when they realized who he was, but the attention never lingered. In that space, he wasn't a CEO. He was just someone's ride home. One evening, Brittany ran toward him holding a paper covered in bright marker. "I got a star," she announced. "That's a very official star," Vernon said, crouching to her level. "What's it for?" "I shared my crayons. That's worth at least 2 stars, he replied. She considered that seriously, then nodded as if he had confirmed an important policy. After school events, they often stopped by the bakery. Sweet Haven had grown busier, word had spread about the quality, and the display case rarely stayed full for long. A small sign near the door now read, "Community Baking Day, first Saturday of every month." The idea had started casually. One afternoon, Vernon had asked, "Do you ever do anything for the neighborhood kids?" Alessia shrugged. "Sometimes we donate extras. What if we planned something regular?" She studied him, gauging whether it was a passing thought. "You mean like a workshop? Or just free treats and decorating? Nothing complicated." The first event had been simple: paper hats, too many sprinkles, and a line of children waiting with wide eyes. Now it happened every month. On those Saturdays, Vernon traded tailored jackets for rolled sleeves, standing behind a folding table while kids debated the correct number of chocolate chips. "You're putting more in your mouth than on the cookie," he told one boy. The kid shrugged. "Quality control. Fair enough," Vernon replied. Flour dusted his hands more often than he expected, and more than once he burned a batch by misjudging the oven timer. Brittany took those moments very seriously. "You forgot again," she said, hands on her hips. "I'm still learning," he admitted. "You need more training." "I agree." Alessia would watch from the counter, amusement softening her expression as he accepted instruction from someone barely tall enough to see over the table. Evenings changed too. The penthouse remained quiet, but not empty in the same way. Some nights, a small pair of shoes sat near the door. Crayon drawings found their way onto the refrigerator. The television played animated movies he would never have chosen himself. One night, while assembling a simple dinner, Brittany tugged his sleeve. "Why do you work so much?" The question wasn't accusing, just curious. He thought about it before answering. "I used to think working more fixed everything," he said. "Did it?" "Some things," he admitted. "Not the important ones." She accepted that without needing further explanation and returned to arranging napkins with extreme concentration. The shift in his priorities didn't go unnoticed at the office. During one meeting, a senior partner remarked, "You've been leaving earlier lately." Vernon nodded. "I have everything all right?" "Yes," he said simply. "Everything's better balanced." That was all the explanation he offered. Balance had once sounded like a luxury he couldn't afford. Now it felt necessary. One late afternoon, after closing, Vernon helped Alessia wipe down the counter while Brittany sorted leftover sprinkles into small jars. "You don't have to stay for cleanup," Alessia said. "I know. Long day?" "Productive," he replied. She glanced at him. "You seem different." He considered that. "Quieter, maybe," he said. "More present," she corrected gently. The distinction mattered. Outside, the sky shifted toward evening, warm light filtering through the front windows. "Look," she said proudly. "It's perfect," Vernon told her. "It's not perfect," she corrected, "but it's good." He smiled. "That's even better." Moments like that had become common. Small, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet they carried a kind of satisfaction no contract had ever delivered. 6 months earlier, his days had been measured almost entirely by output and results. Now they included school pickups, spilled sprinkles, and conversations that had no objective beyond being shared. The company still thrived. The responsibilities hadn't disappeared, but they no longer filled every available space. One evening, as Vernon locked the bakery door after a community event, he paused on the sidewalk. Inside, Alessia laughed at something Brittany said, the sound warm and unguarded. He realized he no longer felt like a visitor standing at the edge of someone else's life. He felt included in it, not because of a single grand gesture. Change hadn't arrived loudly. It had settled in through routines, choices, and the steady decision to stay where he once would have left. And for the first time in years, success was no longer the loudest part of his life. It was simply one piece of it. Brittany climbed onto a stool, holding up a cupcake decorated with uneven lines of icing. The bakery was closed for the evening when Vernon arrived. Because he had shown up, again and again, until his presence stopped being unusual, the front lights were dimmed, leaving only the warm glow from behind the counter. Through the glass, he could see Alessia moving slowly between the work table and the display case, finishing the last small tasks that came after a long day. He tapped lightly on the door. She looked up, surprised, then crossed the room and unlocked it. "You're here late," she said. "So are you." A faint smile passed between them as he stepped inside. The familiar scent of vanilla and warm sugar lingered in the air, softer now without the daytime rush. Somewhere in the back, a timer clicked off, leaving the room wrapped in a comfortable quiet. Brittany sat on a stool near the counter, carefully arranging colored sprinkles into separate jars with intense focus. She looked up the moment she saw him. "Cake man." He laughed quietly. "I was starting to think I might get promoted from that title by now." She considered it seriously. "Maybe." Alessia shook her head, amused. "What brings you by?" she asked. Vernon didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested his hands on the counter, taking in the small details, the handwritten menu, the familiar arrangement of tools, the place that had slowly become part of his weekly routine. "I wanted to talk," he said. Alessia's expression shifted, attentive but calm. Brittany continued sorting sprinkles, humming softly to herself. Vernon reached into his jacket pocket and set a small ring box on the counter. Not flashy, not oversized, simple. Alessia's breath caught almost imperceptibly. "I'm not here to rewrite anything that already happened," he said quietly. "I know I can't." He opened the box, turning it slightly so she could see. "I'm also not asking for a perfect past." The words were steady, not rehearsed, just honest. "I'm asking for a chance at an honest future." Silence settled into the space between them. Not uncomfortable. Full. Alessia looked at the ring, then at him, searching his face the way someone does when they've learned to trust actions more than promises. "You've already changed a lot," she said softly. "I'm still changing," he replied. "I just don't want to do it without you in my life." Brittany slid off the stool, wandering closer without fully understanding the weight of the moment. She glanced at the ring, then at her mother. "Is this the part where you say yes?" she whispered, not nearly as quietly as she thought. A surprised laugh escaped Alessia, breaking the tension just enough. Tears gathered in her eyes, not dramatic, just present. She looked back at Vernon. "No big speeches," she said. "No big speeches," he agreed. Another quiet pause passed, long enough to feel real, not staged. Then she nodded. Yes. The word landed gently, but it carried certainty. Vernon exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He slipped the ring onto her finger, simple, unhurried. No applause. No cameras. Just the soft sound of Brittany clapping once before covering her own mouth like she'd made too much noise. "This means we're officially a team," she announced. Vernon smiled. "I like that." Alessia wiped at the corner of her eye, laughing lightly. "You always did manage to turn serious moments into something simple." "I'm learning," he said. Brittany reached for both their hands, linking them together with determined satisfaction. "Now nobody is leaving," she declared. The statement hung there, innocent, absolute. Vernon squeezed her small hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the evening settled over the quiet street, the world moving at its usual pace beyond the glass. Inside, the bakery held a different rhythm, warm, steady, unhurried. Vernon glanced around the room one more time, the place where a single unexpected visit had reopened a part of his life he thought was gone. Months earlier, success had felt like the loudest measure of who he was. Now, standing between the woman who had once believed in him before any titles existed and the little girl who trusted him without hesitation, the definition had shifted. Not smaller, just clearer. No grand celebration followed, no dramatic music, only 3 people in a modest bakery that smelled like vanilla and second chances. And for the first time in a long while, the future in front of Vernon didn't feel like something he had to control. It felt like something he was finally ready to share. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, real choices, and the moments that quietly change a life, subscribe to Mr. Williams' Storytime and join us for the next one.